Almost the entire population of Canada squeezes into a narrow band along the border with the United States, while everything above it stretches out into one of the emptiest landscapes on the planet. Canada is the second largest country on Earth, and yet if you tried to draw a map of where people actually live, you'd end up with a thin ribbon of cities hugging the 49th parallel, and then almost nothing at all for thousands of kilometers north of it. It's a strange kind of paradox. A country wealthy enough to build some of the most livable cities on Earth simply can't seem to push its population any further inland. In this video, we're going to look at exactly why that is, what it's like for the people who do live up there, and whether any of this is ever likely to change. Start with the numbers, because they tell the story better than almost anything else. Roughly 90% of Canadians live within about 160 kilometers of the US border. Above that line, population density collapses to something like one person for every several square kilometers, and in places like Nunavut, it drops even lower than that. To put that in perspective, Nunavut alone covers close to 2 million square kilometers, an area larger than Mexico, and is home to fewer people than a single mid-sized shopping mall parking lot could hold on a busy Saturday. Fly over it at night, and the difference is obvious. The southern strip of the country lights up like any other developed nation, dense clusters of orange and white stretching from Vancouver to Montreal. Cross north of that line and the lights simply stop. Not dim, not scattered, gone. You could travel for days in a straight line and never pass under a street lamp. The obvious question is why? Canada isn't short on land, and it isn't short on money either. It has one of the largest economies in the world and the technical know-how to build almost anything. So why hasn't a country like that managed to spread its cities out the way, say, the United States or Russia has? The short answer is that the North isn't simply cold and remote in the way people imagine. It's actively hostile to almost every form of permanent settlement in ways that compound on top of each other until building a life there becomes something only a small, specific kind of person is willing to do. Let's start with the most obvious barrier, the cold itself. In much of northern Canada, winter temperatures regularly fall below -50 degrees Celsius, and wind chill can push the effective temperature even lower than that. At those temperatures, the physical world starts behaving strangely. Metal becomes brittle enough to snap under stress that wouldn't bother it in warmer conditions. Plastic loses its flexibility and can shatter like glass if it's dropped. Diesel fuel can gel in a vehicle's tank if it isn't treated properly, and rubber tires lose enough elasticity that they can develop flat spots just from sitting still overnight. This is why in many northern communities vehicles are never fully shut off during the winter months. Engines idle around the clock in parking lots and driveways, not out of carelessness, but because restarting a frozen engine can be next to impossible, and a vehicle that won't start in extreme cold isn't just an inconvenience, it can be a genuine emergency. For a human body, that kind of cold is even less forgiving. Exposed skin can develop frostbite in a matter of minutes, and prolonged exposure without proper gear can be fatal in under an hour. Search and rescue teams in the territories train specifically for this, because a broken down vehicle or a missed turn on a snowmobile trail isn't a minor mishap up there. It's potentially a life or death situation with very little margin for error. People sometimes ask why Canada gets so much colder than parts of Europe sitting at similar latitudes, and the answer mostly comes down to ocean currents and geography. Western Europe benefits from the warm waters of the Gulf Stream drifting up from the tropics, while much of northern Canada instead sits exposed to Arctic air masses and the cold Labrador Current, which drags frigid water and sea ice down along the eastern coastline instead of warmth. The result is a climate that behaves more like Siberia than anything in Western Europe, even though the latitude lines might look similar on paper. That extreme cold does something else too, something that goes far beyond uncomfortable: winters. It freezes the ground itself, permanently. Across huge stretches of northern Canada, the soil never fully thaws, even in summer. This is permafrost, a layer of frozen earth that can extend hundreds of meters below the surface in some areas. It sounds like solid ground you could build on without much trouble, but it's actually one of the biggest engineering headaches in the world. The moment you put a heated building on top of permafrost, the heat radiating downward starts to thaw the ice trapped in the soil beneath it. That thawed ground turns soft and unstable, and buildings constructed without special precautions can sink, tilt, or crack apart within just a few years. Engineers in the north have developed workarounds, elevating buildings on pilings so a layer of cold air can circulate underneath and keep the ground frozen, or using thermosiphons that actively pull heat out of the soil. But these solutions are expensive and they only work at a small scale. Building an isolated research station or a handful of homes this way is manageable. Building an entire city this way, with all its roads, sewer lines, and foundations, becomes an entirely different order of problem, and the costs scale up far faster than the benefits ever could. Agriculture runs into the same wall. Growing food requires a long enough warm season for crops to mature, decent soil, and reliable sunlight, and the Canadian North offers none of those reliably. Summers in the territories can be shockingly short, sometimes just a handful of weeks between the last spring frost and the first one in autumn. And even within that narrow window, a cold snap can roll through and kill off a crop overnight. Combine that with soil that's often thin, rocky, or simply frozen a few inches down, and large-scale farming becomes close to impossible. That means almost everything on a grocery store shelf in a northern community has to be flown or trucked in from thousands of kilometers away, which is exactly why prices in these towns can be shockingly high. It's not unusual for basic staples like milk, eggs, or fresh produce to cost several times what they'd cost in Toronto or Vancouver, simply because of what it takes to get them there. A country can't build large, self-sustaining cities in places where feeding the population requires flying in almost every calorie. Then there's the darkness, which people often underestimate until they actually experience it. In the depths of winter, parts of the far north experience weeks where the sun barely clears the horizon if it rises at all. That extended darkness doesn't just make everyday life logistically harder, it wears people down psychologically too. And it's one of several reasons that living permanently in the far north tends to attract a very particular kind of resident, rather than the broad cross-section of people you'd find in a southern city. Now, even if someone were determined to push past the cold, the frozen ground, and the darkness, they'd run headfirst into another problem. There's often simply no way to get there. Enormous parts of northern Canada, areas each larger than entire European countries, don't have a single kilometre of paved highway connecting them to the rest of the continent. Building a road across permafrost is a nightmare of its own, because the ground beneath it behaves unpredictably. A roadbed that seems stable in winter can turn into a rippling, sinking mess once the surface layer thaws in summer, and the maintenance costs of constantly repairing that kind of damage can dwarf the benefit of having the road in the first place. So, in huge stretches of the territories, the highway network simply stops, and the settlements beyond it become islands, connected to the outside world only by air, or, for a few months each year, by ice. That's where ice roads come in, and they're exactly what they sound like. Temporary routes ploughed directly across frozen lakes, rivers and muskeg, usable only when the ice is thick enough to bear the weight of loaded trucks. For a window of maybe 3 or 4 months each winter, these routes become lifelines, carrying in fuel, construction materials, and heavy equipment that would be far too expensive or simply impossible to fly in. Driving one of these routes is not for the faint of heart. Truckers listen for the sound the ice makes under their tires, watch for cracks forming ahead of them, and know that hitting a soft patch at the wrong moment could mean breaking through into freezing water. Every spring, as the ice starts to weaken, that window closes, and until the following winter, the only way in or out of many communities is by small aircraft. Planes essentially replace the entire road network for these towns, doubling as school buses, grocery delivery trucks, and ambulances all at once. If a storm grounds flights for a few days, a settlement can find itself completely cut off, unable to receive fresh supplies or medical evacuations until the weather clears. There have been northern outposts that quietly emptied out within just a couple of years once air service to them stopped being profitable, their runways slowly swallowed back up by brush and snow. Suppose, though, that money were truly no object, and a government decided it was going to build proper highways through all of it anyway. Even then, there's a deeper obstacle sitting just beneath the surface, one that no amount of funding can simply pave over. Almost half of Canada sits on top of something called the Canadian Shield, a massive horseshoe-shaped slab of some of the oldest exposed rock on the planet, formed billions of years ago when this region was volcanically active. Glaciers spent thousands of years scraping across the surface of the shield, stripping away the soil, sand and clay that might otherwise have supported farmland or easy construction, and dragging all of it further south. What was left behind is a landscape of bare granite, thin, scattered soil, and countless shallow depressions that filled with meltwater to form the tens of thousands of lakes the region is now known for. From above, it looks almost like a maze of stone and water, with barely a flat, dry patch of land to build on. Trying to lay a foundation, run utility lines, or grade a road through terrain like that is enormously expensive, and it's one of the biggest reasons construction costs in the territories can run many times higher than in southern cities for the exact same project. Ironically, that same rock is also where a huge share of Canada's mineral wealth comes from. The Shield holds vast deposits of gold, nickel, copper, and diamonds, among other resources, and mining companies have been pulling wealth out of it for well over a century. But mining doesn't build permanent cities in the way agriculture or manufacturing does. It builds temporary ones. A mining town exists because there's ore in the ground nearby, and the moment that ore runs out, there's rarely any reason for the town to keep existing. Northern Canada is dotted with the remains of settlements that thrived for a decade or two, and then were abandoned almost overnight, once the mine closed, leaving behind rusting machinery and empty houses that nobody bothered to tear down. This creates a very particular culture in a lot of these places, one built around transients. People come north for a highly paid shift work contract, often flying in for a few weeks at a time and flying back out to a home in the south, rather than actually settling down and raising a family in the community itself. For the people who do live in the north full-time, life takes on a rhythm that would feel almost unrecognizable to someone from a big southern city. In many small northern and indigenous communities, there might be a single grocery store, a post office, maybe a school, and a health clinic, and that's essentially the entire built environment. Everyone tends to know everyone else simply because the population is small enough that anonymity isn't really possible. In some communities, it's still common for people to leave their doors unlocked, partly out of trust, and partly so that anyone caught outside in a sudden blizzard or facing down a wandering bear has somewhere immediate to take shelter. Indigenous peoples who have called these lands home for thousands of years have developed deep knowledge of how to survive and thrive in this environment, blending traditional practices like hunting and fishing with whatever modern tools and technology are available, and that knowledge remains genuinely essential to daily survival in a lot of these communities even today. Isolation on this scale does something to people psychologically as well. When the nearest neighboring town might be hundreds of kilometers away across open tundra, a person's entire sense of the world can start to shrink down to the boundaries of their own settlement. Long-term residents and shift workers alike sometimes describe an odd sensation after spending months in that kind of quiet, where returning to a busy southern city and being surrounded by traffic, crowds, and noise again can feel almost overwhelming, even disorienting. Some researchers refer to this general phenomenon informally as a kind of polar adjustment effect, where a person's nervous system essentially recalibrates to the profound quiet of the north and then struggles to readjust once they're thrown back into a louder, busier environment. The economics of daily life up there only reinforce how difficult permanent settlement really is, because nearly everything has to be flown or trucked in over enormous distances. Prices for ordinary household goods can be jaw-dropping compared to what people pay in the South. A carton of milk or a bag of fresh vegetables can cost several times what it would in Toronto or Winnipeg, purely because of what it costs to get it there. Governments subsidize heating and some transportation costs in a lot of these communities, because without that support, simply staying warm through the winter would be financially crushing for a lot of families. Even something as basic as reliable high-speed internet remains a genuine luxury in parts of the north, not something every household can necessarily afford or even access. Trying to build brand new cities under those conditions would mean creating entire populations dependent on constant government support just to maintain a basic standard of living, and that's simply not a trade a modern economy is eager to make. And then there's the land itself, in its rawest form. South of the tree line, the Canadian wilderness is dense, remote, and largely untouched by roads or development, home to some of the largest populations of predators anywhere on the continent. In parts of the boreal forest, visibility can drop to just a few meters in thick brush, and the ground underfoot is often a spongy tangle of moss, fallen trees, and waterlogged peat that makes overland travel exhausting even before you factor in the wildlife. In the short northern summer, huge stretches of this land turn into some of the buggiest environments on Earth, with mosquito and blackfly populations so dense that spending extended time outdoors without serious protective gear becomes genuinely unbearable. Nature, in other words, isn't a passive backdrop up here. It actively resists large-scale human expansion at almost every turn, and it's been remarkably effective at it for centuries. So, what about climate change? It's a fair question, and one people ask a lot. If the planet keeps warming, won't the Canadian North eventually become more livable, maybe even attractive as other parts of the world grow hotter and drier? The honest answer is that it's a lot more complicated than it sounds. Warming temperatures don't turn frozen ground into stable, fertile soil. They turn it into an unstable, waterlogged mess as the permafrost melts. Buildings, roads, and pipelines constructed on what used to be solid frozen ground are already cracking and sinking in parts of the north as the permafrost beneath them thaws. And the cost of repairing or rebuilding that infrastructure is enormous. In that sense, warming doesn't hand the North a blank slate to build on. It actively destabilizes the limited infrastructure that already exists there. On top of that, even a warmer climate wouldn't fix the underlying problem sitting just beneath the surface across half the country. The Canadian Shield's bare rock foundation isn't going anywhere, and thin, rocky soil doesn't suddenly become fertile farmland just because the air temperature rises a few degrees. There are also the simple economic and demographic realities that keep pulling people south, regardless of what the climate does. Canada's entire economy, from its supply chains to its hospitals to its universities, is built around that narrow southern corridor. Relocating meaningful portions of industry or population to the north would require investment on a scale that would likely never pay itself back. And most people, understandably, would rather live somewhere with an established hospital, a stable job market, and reasonable grocery prices than move somewhere they'd need specialized gear just to survive a normal winter. Even as immigration to Canada continues to grow, the overwhelming majority of newcomers settle in existing southern metropolitan areas rather than the territories for exactly these reasons. What that leaves is a north that will likely remain for the foreseeable future, a place people visit and work in rather than one they permanently settle. It's a landscape defined by shift work mining camps, small indigenous and northern communities that have adapted over generations to make life their work, and enormous unbroken wilderness in between. And in some ways, that emptiness has become an asset in its own right. As global demand for fresh water and untouched natural resources continues to grow, having millions of square kilometers of largely undeveloped land sitting on top of enormous mineral wealth and some of the largest freshwater reserves on the planet could end up being one of Canada's biggest long-term strategic advantages. 90% of the country remains empty, not because nobody's tried to change that, and not because of any lack of ambition or money, but because the cold, the rock, the ice, and the sheer scale of the land itself have quietly made the decision for everyone. Some places on Earth simply aren't built to be crowded, and northern Canada might be one of the clearest examples of that anywhere on the planet.